was June 11th, 1979, when the lights finally went out in Los Angeles for John Wayne, who passed away at 72. That moment marked the finale of arguably the most distinctly American career Hollywood had ever witnessed. To the masses, he wasn't just a man. He was the Duke, a colossus who drafted the blueprint of toughness for a whole generation, cowboy warrior icon. Armed with that signature slow drawl and a stare that could freeze water, he transformed Westerns into mythology and turned patriotism into a box office goldmine. Yet strip away the swagger and the Stetson, and you find a human being whose true legacy extended well past the cinema screens, encompassing 3 marriages and 7 offspring. Some of those kids chased the neon lights of Tinseltown, while others opted for the quiet shadows, crumbling slightly under the gravity of that surname. So what exactly happened to the children who grew up beneath the monolith of a man the nation worshipped? Let's look at Patrick Wayne, number 3 in the lineup. If you ask the public, Patrick was the heir apparent, the one shining brightest in the colossal shade his father cast. Entering the world in 1939, right after Stagecoach made his dad a god, Patrick never knew a day without the echo of fame ringing in his ears. They called him Little Duke back then, a kid raised on movie lots, navigating a playground of props dust and the crushing expectation of greatness. When the boy hit 12, the old man stared him down and said, "When they look at you, they're going to see me. Make sure it's worth their while." That wasn't fatherly advice. That was a mandate carved into his future, and Patrick, he stepped right onto that path. Racking up over 40 screen credits, including a dozen side by side with his dad, he shouldered the heavy Wayne banner into Hollywood's new era. He was a staple in heavy hitters like The Searchers McClintock and Big Jake, usually cast as the wholesome son or the loyal deputy. With that square jaw and calm demeanour, Patrick had all the raw materials of a superstar, and in 1977 he grabbed the lead in Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger. This was supposed to be his coronation, the moment he proved he could carry the blockbuster weight alone. Instead, it was the beginning of the end. The movie tanked hard. Critics were ruthless, the fans just didn't show up. Patrick was talented, but he couldn't win the rigged game of comparison. His failure wasn't acting, it was simply not being John Wayne. The limelight faded after that, pushing him toward game show hosting and sporadic roles as the calls stopped coming. Yet even as his personal star cooled off, Patrick remained the most visible ambassador of the clan. You would see him at every festival and memorial, silver hair gleaming, smiling, that familiar smile, unmistakably the son of the giant. In the grand tapestry of the Wayne saga, Patrick is the brave soul who walked straight into the blinding glare of the legend. He couldn't outrun the ghost, but he stood his ground longer than anyone else, a man with a legendary frame stuck in an even bigger shadow. Then we have the 6th child in the lineup, Ethan Wayne. Unlike the older kids who scrambled for a piece of the spotlight Ethan was born into, the sunset years arriving in 1962 when the Duke was already an institution. By then, John Wayne wasn't fighting for respect. He was the American myth in the flesh. When Ethan was learning to walk, his dad wasn't galloping across deserts as much as he was relaxing on the Wild Goose, that massive naval minesweeper he turned into a private palace. That ship bobbing on the Pacific was Ethan's real classroom and childhood sanctuary. On that deck, the Duke taught him practical things, how to coil a rope, tie a knot, and respect the ocean's temper. "Winning isn't everything," John told him once, "but keeping the ship steady, that's non-negotiable." That philosophy defined Ethan's adulthood. Even with a golden last name, he didn't rush toward the cameras as a teen. He started in the dirt, working as a stuntman, learning the grit of the industry from the bottom up. But as time marched on and the Wayne era shifted from current pop culture to nostalgic history, Ethan pivoted to a new role, the gatekeeper. Taking the helm of John Wayne Enterprises and the Cancer Foundation, he wasn't just managing assets, he was defending a bloodline. The real test came in 2011 during a nasty legal brawl over who owned the rights to the Wayne name. Ethan had to face down a room full of sharks, lawyers, historians, and a press hungry for scandal. His power move wasn't a speech, it was placing a small urn of his father's ashes on the table next to his legal pad. It was a silent, devastating message. "This isn't corporate branding to me. This is my father." Today, Ethan works behind the scenes, but his influence is everywhere. He ensures the name Wayne still commands respect at charity galas, museums and courtrooms where reputation is the only currency that matters. He never tried to be the second coming of the Duke. He didn't have to. He didn't become his father. He just made damn sure the world never forgot him. Now let's talk about child number 5, Isa Wayne. In many respects, she was the firecracker of the family, the most vocal, visible and rebellious of the bunch. Born in 1956, she arrived at the absolute peak of the mania. While her older siblings might have known a bit of struggle, Isa was born straight into the imperial phase of the dynasty. We are talking about a childhood defined by Newport Beach mansions, glittering premieres, and a level of privilege that isolates you. Living behind gates with security teams was one thing, but having a father whose rugged face was carved into the very bedrock of American history was an entirely different burden. Isa didn't just grow up viewing John Wayne's blockbusters on a silver screen. She grew up with that booming, iconic voice reverberating through the hallways of her reality. Forget about traditional bedtime tales. Her nights were filled with the sounds of war movie scripts being practiced in the corridor, and instead of casual strolls in the park, she was paraded at glittering award ceremonies where the Duke stood like a titan beside her. Yet beneath all that suffocating grandeur and Hollywood royalty, Isa found herself desperately yearning for a life that was just a little bit more ordinary. Ask her about her most cherished memory and she won't mention a glitzy premiere or a chaotic film set. She goes back to something far more intimate. It is a scratchy, low-quality cassette recording of her dad whistling a sweet lullaby, a private treasure she kept stashed away in a dark drawer for decades to listen to when he was gone on long shoots. That jarring disconnect between the massive public legend and the tender private father figure became the defining struggle of Isa's entire existence. By the time she hit her teenage years, Isa was certain of one thing she had absolutely no intention of following in those giant footsteps or becoming just another Wayne in cowboy boots. Breaking the mold, she pursued a law degree, graduating from Pepperdine University to carve out a career as a family attorney dealing with real-life drama rather than the scripted kind. While her brothers felt the pull to maintain the cinematic empire, Isa was determined to command respect from the judge's bench, though she quickly learned her father's shadow was impossible to outrun. No matter which courtroom she entered or political rally she attended, the ghost of John Wayne was always the uninvited guest, sometimes unlocking impossible doors. But just as often, that massive legacy slammed those doors right in her face. Back in 1991, she released John Wayne, My Father, a memoir exposing the man behind the myth. The pages were filled with raw emotion and protective instincts, yet it certainly wasn't a sanitized fairy tale without its sharp edges. Isa refused to paint a portrait of perfection, instead revealing a man of deep contradictions, the rough cowboy who could be gentle, the fierce patriot with a fiery temper, and the father who loved deeply, but from a distance. The book flew off the shelves and garnered critical acclaim, but ironically it only anchored her more firmly in the celebrity world she had fought so hard to escape. Then came the massive turning point, a scandalous moment that would tear public opinion in two and completely redefine Isa's image in her later years. It was 2016 when she decided to throw her hat in the ring for a seat as a judge in Los Angeles County, expecting a fair fight. She campaigned on her decades of legal experience and moral principles, but the tabloids and newspapers didn't care about attorney Isa Wayne. The headlines screamed, "John Wayne's daughter enters politics," and instantly her famous surname transformed from a golden ticket into a massive target on her back. Political opponents and activist groups started digging through the archives, hunting for anything to use against her. They unearthed explosive, controversial quotes from her father's infamous 1971 Playboy interview, weaponizing his decades-old words against her as if she had spoken them herself. Isa attempted to handle the backlash with grace, insisting, "I am proud to be his daughter, but I am running on my own merits, not his record." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The media frenzy turned vicious, with opinion pieces tearing her apart and social media lighting up with rage. When election night finally came, the results were absolutely crushing. She lost the race, and while it wasn't a landslide defeat, it was enough to signal that the Wayne dynasty no longer held the golden touch it once did, effectively ending her political dreams. However, for a fighter like Isa, this wasn't the end of the road. In the years following, she has doubled down, becoming the fiercest guardian of the family name. Whenever critics demand the removal of John Wayne's name from airports or public plazas or attack his standing in modern society, Asa is usually the first one on the front lines. She doesn't defend him with misty-eyed nostalgia, but rather with a sharp, unapologetic intensity that shuts down the conversation. He was a product of his era, not a man without flaws, she boldly declared during a live television appearance, refusing to apologise for history. She argues that if we start erasing every historical figure who ever spoke imperfectly, we will eventually be left with an empty history book and no lessons learned. That stance, much like Isa herself, ignited a firestorm of debate, but she stood her ground, cementing her status as the most complex and polarising member of the Wayne clan. She isn't the darling of the fan club, nor is she the silent observer. She is the provocateur who speaks up exactly when keeping quiet would be the easier path. This is the daughter who actively chose the law over Hollywood's lights, only to find herself in a perpetual battle to preserve the very legacy she tried to sidestep. She walked into high-stakes court battles and media interviews carrying a surname that had the power to instantly crown her as royalty or crush her ambitions into dust. In the end, she didn't run away from the Wayne legend. She sprinted alongside it, even when the weight of it threatened to trip her up at every turn. Now, looking back at the start of the dynasty, the very first of John Wayne's 7 children was Michael Wayne. Unlike his younger siblings, Michael wasn't moulded by the blinding glare of established superstardom, but rather by the relentless grind of a father still fighting for a foothold. Born way back in 1934, Michael entered the world when the future Duke was still just Marion Morrison, a struggling actor trapped in B-grade westerns and barely scraping by. He didn't spend his childhood running through the halls of sprawling Beverly Hills mansions or enjoying the perks of unlimited wealth. His reality was watching his dad leave the house in the pitch black of pre-dawn and return coated in desert grit, exhausted from roles that paid peanuts and offered zero job security. To young Michael, John Wayne was never a mythical movie god. He was simply a hard-working guy with rough, calloused hands carrying the heavy burden of providing for his family. That gritty perspective is likely why Michael never felt the urge to don the cowboy hat on screen. He aimed to construct something quieter, but infinitely more stable behind the camera. Even as a teenager, Michael felt no magnetic pull toward the flashing bulbs of the paparazzi. He had zero appetite for the applause or the vanity of close-ups. Instead, he poured his energy into studying business and film production at Loyola University, becoming obsessed with the nuts and bolts of the industry, the logistics, rather than the emotions. While his brothers and sisters were out joyriding horses on the movie sets, you would find Michael sitting quietly in the producer's tent. He was there observing the chaos, watching budgets skyrocket and schedules collapse, and his keen eye for the business side did not go unnoticed by his father. Back in 1960, the production of The Alamo was absolute chaos, and amidst the madness, John Wayne threw his son into the deep end with a massive logistical nightmare to manage. It wasn't just a job, it was an initiation by fire, and Michael aced it. That moment forged a bond that went beyond blood. They became the ultimate fixer and star duo. Michael stepped up to run Batjack Productions, the engine behind the Duke's brand, steering the ship for massive blockbusters like McClintock, the polarising The Green Berets, and the classic Chisholm. But don't mistake him for a glorified assistant organising schedules. He was building an empire from the ground up, structuring complex distribution deals and locking down foreign rights like a seasoned studio tycoon. When the Duke passed in 1979, Michael inherited a job description that didn't exist, guardian of a myth that the entire world felt they owned. He was the one who fired the first legal shots to trademark the John Wayne name, securing the brand against unauthorised poachers. And he poured the concrete for the family's philanthropic arm, laying the groundwork for what we now know as the massive John Wayne Cancer Foundation. However heavy is the head that wears the crown. In the wake of the funeral, the family started fracturing over money, trademarks, and what the legacy should actually look like. Michael fought to keep a tight grip on the reins to ensure quality control across the board. But his siblings didn't always fall in line. The family business quickly turned into a battleground of egos and legalities. Fate dealt him a cruel hand in 1985 when he was diagnosed with prostate cancer, the very killer his father's foundation was built to fight. Most men would have folded under that pressure, but Michael just shifted into a higher gear. He holed up in a gritty office above a warehouse, tirelessly mapping out the next 2 years of the Wayne Empire while fighting for his own life. His body was withering, but his spirit was bulletproof. He famously told a reporter, "People think we are just polishing a statue. We aren't. We are keeping the spirit of a man alive with all the guts, grit and flaws that made him real." That was his crusade, not to create a saint, but to ensure the world remembered the human being behind the cowboy hat. When Michael Wayne died in 2003, the general public barely noticed, even as they continued to worship his father. He never chased the limelight or the film festival circuit, but inside Hollywood and the family trust, his power was absolute. Nowadays, every officially licensed mug, every curated museum exhibit, and every quote plastered on a wall carries the invisible, indelible mark of Michael Wayne's hard work. He was the dutiful son who skipped the fame but carried the burden, ensuring the legend didn't dissolve into cheap fiction. Then there is the youngest of the clan, Marissa Wayne, the 7th child in the lineup. By the time she arrived in 1966, her dad wasn't chasing stardom anymore. He was the living definition of it. Marissa never saw the rugged cowboy galloping through the desert dust in a 10-gallon hat. She got the exhausted patriarch in a leather recliner, clutching a remote and watching his old movies with the sound turned down. She didn't grow up dodging cables on movie sets. She grew up in Newport Beach, surrounded by ocean breezes and cigar smoke, as her dad faced his final act. The version of John Wayne that the world idolised Marissa never met him. She knew the man battling cancer, softened by chemo and slowed by surgeries, yet still filling every room he entered with his massive presence. To her, he wasn't a cinema god. He was a father racing against time to leave a mark on his kids before the credits rolled. Growing up, Marissa lived a life that was both incredibly sheltered and cast in a giant shadow. Being the baby meant she dodged some of the heavy expectations her older siblings carried, but the name Wayne still came with plenty of pressure. Even in his twilight years, the Duke hadn't gone soft on his core principles. He told her straight, "You don't cry to get what you want. You look them in the eye and you take it." That wasn't just dad advice. It was the ironclad philosophy of the Wayne dynasty passed down like gold. Although he died when she was only 13, that lesson dictated her entire life. She stayed far away from the acting bug. She didn't even jump into the family business arms at first, choosing to carve out her own quiet lane. She poured her energy into sports, raising her own kids, and eventually finding her footing in public advocacy work. But as she got older, Marissa realised that carrying the Wayne name wasn't just about looking back fondly. It was a duty specifically in a modern world that was rapidly turning its back on the values of her father's era. While her brothers handled the contracts and the lawsuits, Marissa found herself drafted into the culture wars surrounding her dad's image. The explosion happened in 2020 when waves of protests hit the United States and activists in Orange County demanded the airport drop John Wayne's name. They weaponized his 1971 Playboy interview, citing his racially charged and politically incorrect comments as proof that he had no place representing modern American values. Suddenly, the quietest Wayne became the family's fiercest defender. She hit the interview circuit and wrote scathing op-eds to fight back. She stepped in front of the cameras not to validate every script line or interview quote her father ever delivered, but to protect the human being behind the legend. You simply cannot put a man from a bygone era on trial using the moral compass of today, she insisted during a heated interview. She warned that hitting delete on our history means scrubbing away the hard lessons we need to learn, a statement that immediately set social media on fire with controversy. While cable news pundits debated whether the Wayne dynasty was clutching onto a problematic past that should be buried, Marissa refused to back down an inch. At a tense town hall gathering in Orange County, she took the stage, gripping the folded burial flag from her father's funeral, her voice trembling but resolute. She described a patriot who adored this nation, a star who defined the silver screen, and a father who sacrificed everything for his own blood. She asked the crowd, if a life like that isn't worth honouring, then what exactly are we doing? That speech turned her into the family's most powerful emotional shield. She might not be signing the checks or running the boardroom strategy, but when the mob comes for the legacy, she is the one who takes the stand. You will see her popping up at museum openings, sitting for deep dive interviews and appearing on podcasts to share the gritty, real moments of growing up Wayne. She talks about the tender stuff like him brushing out her tangles before the school bus arrived or whispering dad jokes in the ICU when the end was near. To the die-hard fan base, she provides the one thing the polished biographies miss: raw, unfiltered intimacy. She paints a picture of John Wayne not as the gunslinger or the general, but as a fragile old man holding his daughter's hand. In the Wayne family saga, she writes the emotional finale. It is not just because she is the baby of the bunch, but because she operates on pure feeling rather than calculated PR moves. She isn't the enforcer, the high-priced attorney, or the CEO looking at profit margins. She is the grieving daughter who felt the cut, the deepest standing firm against a modern culture, eager to toss her dad aside like expired film footage. She isn't guarding a trademark, she's guarding her dad. Then there is the fourth branch of the Wayne family tree, the often overlooked Melinda Wayne. Although you won't catch her name splashing across tabloid covers or cinema marquees, her backstage influence on the Wayne Empire has been massively consequential. Entering the world in 1940, right when her father was on the verge of exploding into Hollywood's biggest box office, Draw Melinda was born into a life in transition. Back then, her dad was still grinding, bouncing between dusty sets and playing the heavy in cheap Western flicks just to keep the lights on. Meanwhile, her mother Josephine was the anchor running a tight ship built on strict structure and traditional Catholic discipline. Unlike her big brother Michael, who shouldered the heavy burden of the name, or the younger siblings who knew only jets and mansions, Melinda lived in the gap between two realities. She had one foot planted in a scrappy blue-collar upbringing, while the other was stepping into the blinding glare of superstardom. Melinda keeps her lips sealed mostly, but industry insiders who have worked with the estate claim she was always the watcher, the one taking mental notes. Even as a little girl, she picked up on the tiny human details that the cameras and directors completely ignored. She noticed how he lined his boots up by the door with military precision, or how he would go dead silent after shooting a particularly brutal gunfight scene. She saw that he wasn't big on saying, "I'm sorry," but he would make up for it by surprising her with a box of vanilla donuts the next morning. When she turned 8, the Duke gave her a portable radio he had picked up on location in Texas, telling her to use it to tune into the world, not to hide from it. That piece of advice wired her brain, shaping exactly how she viewed her larger-than-life father and the chaotic world he eventually left behind. Melinda never caught the acting bug, nor did she chase the glitter of her own celebrity status. She stayed out of the frame, building a private life centred on her kids, her religion, and an intense sense of obligation to the bloodline. However, when John passed in 1979 and the legal sharks started circling to fight over his rights and image, Melinda was dragged into a job she never applied for: the authenticity police. While her brothers were busy cutting deals and managing the brand's stock, Melinda became the fact-checker. She was the one digging through dusty filing cabinets, reading the fine print and shutting down anyone trying to rip off her dad's likeness. She was the voice in the lawyer's ear, telling them whether a new project genuinely reflected her father's values or if it was just a cheap cash grab. Her knowledge wasn't just sentimental. She had an encyclopedic memory of every contract, every role and every line he ever delivered. The real drama popped off in 1999 when a massive ad agency tried to digitally insert John Wayne into a cigarette commercial, endorsing a product he never signed off on. The campaign was slick, wrapped in patriotism, and the agency's legal sharks argued it was fair use, thinking the family would roll over. But for Melinda, this was war. She spearheaded the internal battle to sue them into oblivion, refusing to let them use her father as a puppet. Breaking her usual silence, she stepped up at a press conference, held up a photo of the ad, and delivered a line that silenced the room. "My father died of cancer. You do not get to use his face to peddle the very poison that took him from us. The sight of the typically shy Wayne daughter standing tall and fighting for her father's dignity sent shockwaves through the industry. Ever since that showdown, Melinda has retreated back to the shadows, remaining a powerful ghost in the machine of the Wayne estate. You won't see her rubbing elbows at red carpet galas, but if there is a lawsuit or a new documentary in the works, you better believe she approves the final cut. She is the firewall, ensuring they use his actual words rather than fake Hollywood scripts. She makes sure his face only lands on projects he would have been proud of, guaranteeing that no one turns the Duke into a cheap caricature. Whenever the family gathers behind closed doors, she is the one pumping the brakes constantly, asking the hard questions. Is this really him? Would he actually sign off on this? Is this what he wanted? When looking at the massive empire John Wayne left behind, Melinda does not play the role of the fighter, the dazzling entertainer, or the legal shark. Instead, she acts as the guardian of his moral compass. She is the keeper of the flame, who recalls that long before the global superstardom, there was just a flesh and blood man with specific values, personal demons and moral boundaries he refused to compromise. While others may have inherited the glamour and the flashing cameras, Melinda inherited something far heavier, the solemn duty to keep the family narrative truthful. Then there is the second born of the Duke's brood of 7, Tony Wayne, who arguably holds the title of the most enigmatic and elusive figure among all the Wayne daughters. Coming into the world back in 1936, Tony was born to a father who was still just Marion Morrison, a struggling actor scraping by in the dusty corners of the industry, taking thankless gigs in low-budget westerns. At that specific moment in time, the bright lights of Hollywood success were still a million miles away from their doorstep. The household was far from glamorous. They were bouncing between modest rental properties in Southern California while John tried to put food on the table with a winning smile that the camera loved, even if his bank account didn't show it. Consequently, Tony's formative years were completely devoid of velvet ropes, glitzy premieres, or the luxury that later defined the Wayne name. Her childhood memories consist of wearing hand-me-down clothes and sitting quietly in church pews next to her mother every Sunday morning, far removed from Tinseltown. She also got used to the empty chair at the dinner table, watching her dad vanish for weeks on end to shoot on location. She was a daughter of the struggle born long before the myth took over. As that myth began to swell and consume the man, she knew Tony made a conscious choice to stay in the shadows, watching her father's meteoric rise from the safety of her kitchen rather than the red carpet. By the time she hit her teenage years, the release of Red River had cemented his status as a cinematic god, and the public's perception of the Duke began to eclipse the simple dad she had grown up with. However, unlike her brothers, who desperately tried to carve out their own space in the entertainment industry, or her sisters, who later took active roles in managing the estate and brand, Tony had zero interest in defining her identity through her father's celebrity. That is not to say she was estranged or cold toward him. The bond was there, just kept out of the public view. She was a regular face at private family barbecues and would occasionally drop by the film sets, even stepping in as an extra for brief moments in The Quiet Man and The Alamo, though you would have to squint to find her. In The Alamo specifically, she blends into the background so effectively that even the most obsessive John Wayne scholars often miss her presence entirely, but she never did it for the screen time. For Tony, these weren't career moves, they were silent acts of love, small ways to share a moment with a father who belonged more to the world than he did to his kids. As she transitioned into adulthood, Tony charted a course that veered sharply away from the family business. While the rest of the Wayne clan built empires or careers tethered to the Duke's legacy, she opted for total anonymity, getting married, raising her babies, and drifting further into a private existence. She managed no production companies, signed no autograph deals, and sat for no tell-all interviews to trade on her memories of life with the biggest star on the planet. In the end, she transformed into a ghost of a figure known to the world only through the stories other people told about her. Her entire lifestyle was anchored in strict privacy, which in itself was likely a quiet rebellion against the suffocating pressure of carrying one of the most famous surnames in history. Yet stepping out of the spotlight did not shield her from the emotional fallout of that name, and her most painful moment arrived in 1979, shortly after the Duke took his final breath. When the family convened to hear the reading of the last will and testament beginning the messy business of dividing the empire, Tony was blindsided by the realization that she had been largely left out of the major financial inheritance. It didn't turn into a tabloid splash or a headline-grabbing feud. The betrayal remained a private wound. There were no screaming matches in court, just a heavy, deafening silence that spoke volumes about her pain. During the funeral service, witnesses noticed Tony standing near the back, draped in a black shawl, with a stoic face that refused to give the paparazzi anything to work with. She held back her tears whenever a lens was pointed in her direction, refusing to grieve for public consumption. However close friends noticed a heartbreaking gesture, she slipped a solitary faded black and white snapshot into the casket, a picture of her and her dad on horseback during the filming of The Quiet Man. It was her final silent goodbye, a desperate attempt to keep one tiny piece of their relationship just for herself in a world that claimed to own him. Throughout the decades that rolled on, Tony remained a mystery to the masses, often omitted from lists when tribute events were organised in her father's honour. Whenever journalists came knocking for a quote or a story, she responded with a polite but firm no. Even as the John Wayne brand exploded into a merchandising juggernaut of coffee table books and museum exhibits, she kept her distance, though she never vanished completely from the family fold. She was always there for the personal milestones, the christenings, the weddings, the quiet dinners where cameras weren't allowed. Her own children describe her as a gentle, grounding spirit who spoke of the icon not as a cowboy hero, but simply as a hard-working dad who came home exhausted. In the complex mosaic of the Wayne dynasty, Tony isn't the flashy centre tile. She is the grout that holds the edges together, unnoticed, subtle, but absolutely fundamental to the reality of the family. Her refusal to live for an audience might actually be the most authentic legacy of all in a family that was built on celluloid dreams. She never chased the glow of the spotlight. Instead, she walked softly in its shadow, guarding the intimate memories that the rest of the world never got to see. Yet the saga of the Wayne family is merely one chapter in a sprawling book of Hollywood folklore where the giants who stood 10 feet tall on the silver screen often left behind wreckage that was incredibly fragile. 7 children, and every single one of them carries a completely different version of the Duke in their hearts and minds. To some, he was the patriarch, to others, a boss, an idol, or practically a stranger. Sadly, this fractured dynamic is far from rare in Tinseltown. All across the golden hills of Hollywood, there are other dynasties built on immortal names that are quietly cracking apart, bleeding in silence, and hiding secrets that never made the final cut. In our upcoming episodes, we are going to pry open the doors of those hidden legacies, exploring truths that aren't found in the credits, but in the painful silence of what was left unsaid. You really don't want to miss the drama coming next, so hit that subscribe button to stay in the loop. And join us as we expose the secret lives and scandals of your favourite legends. Thanks for listening.